People often ask me if I think there's a connection between Turkey's megalithic enclosures and Malta's temples. Well, there's quite a time difference, first of all. Göbekli Tepe was built around 9600 BCE and was purposefully abandoned and buried sometime after 8000 BCE. Malta's temple people are thought to have arrived on the islands and spearheaded what's known as the Zabush phase around 3800 BCE, and then to have started building the temples several hundred years later. So there's around 4,500 years between Göbekli Tepe and the earliest temples, which include Gigantia, Santa Verna, and Hajar-im. Strangely, there don't seem to be any megalithic sites that date to the time in the middle. There are earlier sites than Malta, but not that much earlier. If there were, you could say that the megalithic architecture of Anatolia and the rituals that took place within those buildings constituted a culture that made its way westwards, establishing its presence in multiple locations over time, but changing its outward appearance based on local traditions. However, there does seem to be quite a missing link time-wise. Malta's megalithic temples are certainly some of the oldest in Eurasia, and yet were still built many, many generations after those of Anatolia. I do think there's a link. I think all megalithic cultures must have had some sort of link, but the nature of it is unknown to us at the moment. There are some obvious similarities, of course. The oval enclosures of Gobekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe are somewhat reminiscent of the Maltese temples, although without the clear apsidal symmetrical form. The megalithic aspects are quite similar, but we could say that about many such sites. I guess what's interesting in Turkey is quite a few megalithic monuments have been found, including the destroyed Nevali Kuri, Hamzan Tepe, and Sefer Tepe. So it's probable there were a significant number of megalithic sites in the region, some of which have been destroyed or haven't yet been found, and they made up a sophisticated cult location. Malta also has many temple remains and plenty of art that show it was also a significant cult centre. Ritual feasting is known to have taken place in Göbekli Tepe and the Maltese temples. Neither have evidence of domestic dwellings amongst their cult complexes, so some experts think they may even have been pilgrimage sites. The iconography is pretty different though. The oldest part of Göbekli Tepe has around 20 oval enclosures with hundreds of T-shaped pillars in total, many of which are decorated with an exotic array of animals in high relief, and on occasion stylized humans. In contrast, Malta's animal symbolism is a little more basic, usually in low relief, and pretty much just covers bulls, sheep, and goats. The human statues in Malta are mostly of headless, corpulent figures rather than stylized versions of humans carved into flat surfaces. The phallic symbolism found at Karahan Tepe is also found at the Tarshian temples, but phallic symbolism is fairly common at many points of history, so it's important not to assume a connection. So those are my thoughts on the similarities between the two megalithic regions, but in this video I mostly want to talk about the evidence for a skull cult and the presence of alcohol at Göbekli Tepe. When I was researching my recent video on the headless statues found in abundance at the Maltese temples, it occurred to me that I had read something a while ago about headless symbolism at Gobekli Tepe and a number of other ideas about the rituals that took place there. As the earliest megalithic site currently known, this might help us to give context to the sites which came later. So I think a good place to start is beer. In the paper, The Role of Cult and Feasting in the Emergence of Neolithic Communities, New Evidence from Göbekli Tepe, southeastern Turkey, written in 2012, the researchers, including the late Klaus Schmidt, put forward the argument that a cohesive and complex society must have existed in the region for these sites to have been built. A lot of quarrying, moving of stones, and carving was needed to create the megalithic buildings and their art. Since this was before the agricultural revolution, during what's called the pre-pottery Neolithic A, the researchers suggested that there had to be several factors which drove this level of cohesiveness, and these factors may have included feasting and alcohol. 6-barrel and trough-shaped vessels, which could have held up to 160 litres of liquid, were excavated from Gobekli Tepe and found to contain oxalate, which is released from malt during mashing and usually needs to be removed from beer kegs. The tests were not conclusive, but if evidence for the fermentation of beer can be confirmed, then it's thought a taste for alcohol may have been the key driver behind crop domestication in the region. Evidence for large-scale feasting has been found in the form of huge amounts of animal bones. These animals include gazelles, aurochs, and wild asses. So group feasting certainly took place, and if this was accompanied by alcohol, then it's likely that crop domestication and food surpluses gained importance and helped to organize these hunter-gatherers into a more complex society. For a long time, it was thought that the agricultural revolution preceded organized ritual practices and the building of megalithic monuments, but it's now thought that it was ritual practices that drove the agricultural revolution instead, and it's entirely possible that these rituals included both feasting and the consumption of beer. But there's another element to the rituals which cannot be overlooked. In the 2017 paper, Modified Human Crania from Göbekli Tepe provide evidence for a new form of Neolithic skull cult. The researchers discussed their analysis of skull fragments. Just as with the megalithic buildings in Malta, Göbekli Tepe's enclosures are often referred to as temples because it's clear ritual activity took place in them, and there's little to no evidence of primary burials, so they aren't thought to be elaborate tombs. However, at Gobekli Tepe, fragments of human bone have been found, and the majority of these belong to skulls. These crania show evidence for modifications, including a drilled hole, carvings, and the addition of ochre. They also show signs of defleshing immediately after death. Cervical vertebrae, also excavated from the site, indicate decapitation. Researchers think that all this evidence points towards some sort of skull cult, but with its own distinct practices that are quite different to that found elsewhere. The author suggests that a deliberately decapitated statue, a figurine carrying a human head, and a low-relief carving of a headless person on Pillar 43 in Enclosure D all point towards a skull cult. Cut marks and coloration have been seen on other skulls at Neolithic sites in Anatolia and the Near East, but the carvings and drilled perforation are quite unusual. It's possible the perforated skull was drilled so that it could be hung somewhere or attached to something, perhaps being a focal point of a specific ritual. It's hard to know what was happening in the Neolithic because there are no written records from that period, but skull cults within the historic period that have been studied by anthropologists usually find the modifications to the crania match a specific practice, such as veneration of the dead or fertility rites. Skulls have also been known to represent prestige or to be used for magical protection. However, the modifications at Gobekli Tepe are different to those from the Paleolithic, different from those of the same time period, and different from those catalogued more recently by anthropologists. So what we can gather is that there's a reasonable possibility that Gobekli Tepe was built and frequented by an alcohol-fueled feasting skull cult, whose megalithic monuments and symbolic art were an integral part of their rituals, the nature of which is still not really known. On the surface, this all sounds rather creepy, but it may well have been an important way for these people, aware of their mortality, to feel a connection to the afterlife and to find meaning in it. And it's hard to ignore the fact that their cult flourished at the end of the Younger Dryas period, a time which, as we all know, was marked by climatic upheaval and possibly catastrophe. Magic and ritual have been used for thousands of years by multiple cultures to help them feel like they have control over their environment. Magic is often driven by fear. So it's possible that Gobekli Tepe was a sort of magical talisman built by a scared people who wanted to gain back control of their lives and their futures, with the help of the ancestors, of course. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. I finally launched a Patreon if you would consider supporting me through it. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter for more content. I'm posting pretty often. And take a look at my website for more information on the places I visit.